Welcome back to the Philips African Dialogues, where we're discussing strategies needed to address Africa's skills gap. Still with me in studio, JJ van Dongen, Senior Vice President and Market Leader for Philips Africa, Dani Steyn, Director for Skills for Africa, Loan Sharp, Labour Economist at AdCorp, Ibrima Fal, Director for the Southern African region for the African Development Bank, and joining us now from the east of the continent, from our bureau in Nairobi, James Maru, Assistant Director for the Kenyan Ministry of Labour. James, before I get to you, just want to pick up on one point that was made before the break. Dani, give us your view right now on the role that public-private partnerships play in the agricultural space and what type of shape they should be taking.
I think we have the same situation that Philips have, in that we have machinery producers, we have harvesters, tractors, and those people must all be trained to run them, to look after them. Whether they're doing enough in that field, I'll leave to the farmers to give you an answer. I sometimes think
give us what they whisper in your ear.
They don't really do it, because the farmers have then got to do it, because it's important to him that he doesn't have downtime. And therefore he does it himself. But the firms who provide them could spend more on training the people, maintaining these machines. Mm-hmm. But apart from that, there's fertilizer, there's poisons, there's seed companies. They do training to train people to work for them as well. But I see a private partnership in a social responsibility as well, to fund things that are not directly related to a business, but which will better the life of those people, particularly in the agricultural section, particularly in the low levels, the subsistent level. If you can get them away from what I said just now, eat, but to eat and sell, and to provide sufficient funding to support those people to get off the ground. What I often find in a social responsibility, it's a numbers game. Some firm or mine or something wants to say, I train 50 people, so he gives something and they train them in vegetable production, and that's where it ends. They don't take it through, mentor them, monitor them so that they become sustainable, because most of these people... Empowered, because what happens to most of them, they learn to produce vegetables, they produce them on the first season, then they eat them all up, but they don't put the money away to produce again. Then they look for another grant. Yeah. A grant gets votes, but a grant does not alleviate poverty. A social responsibility does not alleviate poverty unless it is geared for producing profit. Yeah. The only thing where you get poverty alleviation is where you create with your grant a business which creates a profit, which contains a sustainability, a routine that carries on.
And can grow itself.
And grows itself,
yes. Let's take the discussion to Kenya and get an understanding of the kind of skills gap that we're looking at, specifically now in the Kenyan economy. As I said, we've got James Maru joining us from Nairobi. James, thanks for joining us today. Talk to us about the focus right now when it comes to the Labour Ministry in Kenya, when it comes to addressing the skills gap, and where do you see the deficit the largest in Kenya?
Well, skill gaps in Kenya is a reality, because you will find that there's an existence of demand and oversupply running parallel. That's to say that you have areas where we have got a lot of skills, and then areas where there are none. This is because there has been for a long time a skills mismatch, because the production of skills has been supply driven rather than demand driven.
Which sectors specifically are you seeing a deficit? You say there are areas where there are more pronounced skills gaps. Tell us about the sectors right now that need the skills the most.
For a long time, we focused on maybe the social sciences, and we did not address ourselves to the hard sciences, where we have, for example, physicists, doctors, so that you'll find that at the end of the day you may be having a very inappropriate ratio of doctors to the population, engineers, and we've just traditionally kept producing some, skills. I'm looking at areas, for example, where we have emerging skills at the moment. We have recently discovered oil, we are discovering gas, there's the issue of the wind energy, the solar energy. Mm-hmm. These are areas where we need skills like now. Mm-hmm. But then again, we didn't do a proper forecasting in terms of skills development. So we just continue traditionally producing maybe social scientists, teachers, maybe veterinarians and all that. And yet the orientation was changing, and we were slow in reading the science on the wall, so to speak.
It's almost like, just we're coming back to the studio here, James, just to get some comments from studio. It's almost like the system, the economy moves faster, and of course we're talking about bureaucracies and the kind of slow pace of change in universities to adapt to the new reality. I mean, looking at renewable energy, it's taken off in Kenya. We know that technology has taken off there too. How do you make sure that change happens more quickly at universities?
Yeah, clearly, I mean, what we discussed before, the issue of having industry, private sector, in the curriculum of the universities is one answer. But I think we also have to now come back and say what has been the paradigm shift in the youth population. I mean, you're looking at a population that is much more tech savvy. You're looking at the population unlike us. I mean, growing up, you want to graduate and come back and work for the government or work for the UN or something like that. They don't want that. I mean, they want to create their own businesses. And I think that if they are properly skilled and if programs are tailored, and I think, I mean, perhaps something between high school and the university, what we're seeing in the ICT sector, for example, is that a lot of them don't need to have university degrees, but they need to have some kind of certification that would allow them in this dynamic world to be able to have the skills needed to supply what Philips might need. Yeah. So I think, I mean, you empower them, as somebody had said earlier, to be able to actually do themselves and create the jobs for themselves rather than government creating it for them.
Does this bring up the whole issue around kind of vocational training, short courses, as opposed to that kind of 4-year honours degree? Is there a role for that, and should there be a greater emphasis, perhaps even from a private sector funding perspective, on building the skills, those skills as they come, those niche skills?
We've had to do that in the company ourselves. So employees joining us, we have a number of programs. We have a traineeship program, so young graduates or technical staff coming in, we train them over a period of 1 year. But we also see that needed also in the more middle and senior management as well. So as an example, we ran last year a strategy training on-the-job program for our top 35 managers in Africa. We actually trained them on what is strategy, demystify it, get them to understand that it's really developing really strong action plans going forward and rigorously executing that. So providing them that skills that they probably didn't get at university, or they may have got a theoretical knowledge of it, but on the practical in their own business. So someone someone working in Nigeria on solar street lighting, for example, will develop a strategy around that particular area. So really on the ground vocational training related to their job that they're doing. And that is, we found that is really beneficial. The staff enjoy it, it enriches them. They don't necessarily get a certificate at the end, but they've actually been trained and enriched so that they can apply
their job better.
They do their job better.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I am all for that. I mean, it's almost a caricature when I hear the ministers from Kenya and Nigeria. It's almost a caricature of the mistakes that we're making in South Africa. We hoped in the mid-90s that by upskilling millions of people, that we would suddenly find them jobs. It's been a total failure. We have to recognize that. There's no additional employment. In fact, the economy's shed 1 million jobs. since the mid-1990s. So we obviously have to look at a different model for skills development, and I'm delighted to hear what Philips is doing on the ground, because I'm a firm believer in company-conducted training, training on the job, and not so much an emphasis on theoretical training in universities and technical colleges. It sounds to me like the Kenyans and the Nigerians are making some of the mistakes South Africa's made. We don't have a shortage of money in South Africa. You know, the National Skills Fund is sitting by some accounts on nearly 5 billion rand of unspent money available for training, but the government institutions simply can't deliver. They can't spend. So I think we need a completely different model in South Africa. I think we need to look more to the private sector, to companies driving the training, and less reliance on government institutions, FETs. I think it's going to be a waste of money in the end.
James, if we could just bring you into this, because you've been hearing comments we've been making here about South Africa and perhaps Kenya moving down a path where it could make the mistakes that we've made here when it comes to upskilling people, because there has been a strong focus for many years on the importance of skills to address the unemployment gap. How do you ensure that you take Kenya down the correct path right now? And are you looking at bringing the private sector in, making sure that they're an integral part of the education system?
Exactly. I think what I talked about earlier, I was looking at where we've come from, in the sense that we've had the traditional schooling where we have time-bound courses where you must finish 7 or 8 years in primary, then you go to secondary, then you get a certificate, then maybe go to a tertiary institution. But the emerging trend, and Kenya has an explosion in terms of technology based on ICT. And the realization is that the policies that the government has been pursuing over time are no longer tenable, because right now you don't need to have a degree, as one of the panelists says. You maybe just need some certification in the field of in that respective field, and you may just need a short course of 3-6 months, and you are in business. And you'll realize that in Kenya there is a very huge element in terms of the PPP, that's the partnership between the public and the private. In the field of ICT, you'll find that the private players, entrepreneurs, are assisting the startups to realize their dreams by exploiting the ICT arena, which is offering a lot of opportunities, so that we are tending towards more of self-employment rather than the kind of education that we inherited from the British, and which we seem to have perpetuated over time, where we're training people for the job market, and yet the economy is not growing fast enough to accommodate job creation. Mm-hmm. So the shift currently is that the approach towards skills development is on a needs base, where industry, that is the private sector, and the entrepreneurs in education. I would want to say that the public institutions, the middle level and the universities, are still following the old system. But you'll find that the numerous education providers that are coming up in the private sector do a lot of market research for the kind of skills that are required by industry, and in so doing they develop courses that are tailor-made, that at the end of it you don't find a graduate tarmacking, because from the public universities you may find a graduate tarmacking for 5 years and maybe going into opening a small kiosk, a business that he didn't even study, he doesn't have the skills. Mm-hmm. So there's that realization, and given that in Africa we really do not have the luxury of studying for the sake of it. We go to school because we want to have a job, so that we can build ourselves and help our immediate and extended families.
Yeah.
So it's an investment, and when you invest in a person and he comes back and tarmacs without getting a job, then it's a wasted, those are wasted resources.
Almost saying you measure the education system by the ability of it to create jobs for people, or the ability of people to have a job at the end of it. We know that there's a problem in South Africa when it comes to that. You were nodding your head there, so any points you want to pick up on from the Kenyan perspective?
I also think that, the broader context, looking 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road, you have globally a changing demographics where the Western countries are getting older. We have most of the young population. A model that has proven itself very well is the health, the training of nurses in Philippines, and for export, right? So that generates remittances, generates foreign exchange, yet creates jobs. Right? So given the youthfulness of our population, yes, we have to satisfy the internal market, the skills gap in the internal market, but perhaps also look at it as a way of earning actually foreign exchange for the economy.
Certainly is an interesting there, and I suppose we could move that conversation into the role of the diaspora in Africa and in Kenya. We know that there's a large population that sends home money to local Kenyans. So Minister, James, could you just give us some insight into what the focus is now from the Labour Ministry when it comes to tapping into the skills that the diaspora have, the knowledge, the expertise, and perhaps the wealth that they've been able to create outside of Kenya, and helping to use that to help grow the local skills base?
Currently, we're in the process of developing a database of the skills that the Kenyans in the diaspora have. This is one, so that we know the kind of skills that they have and see how best we can utilize. We appreciate that at the moment we have the virtual interaction, where you can even have doctors abroad guiding an operation in a local hospital if the appropriate connectivity is there. So we've been in the process of conducting a kind of skills survey, where we want to build an inventory where we can reach out to the Kenyans out there, if and when we find that the skills they have are relevant, and maybe we may not be having it locally here, and we want to tap it. Because sometimes, because of the labor market dynamics, that is the pull and push aspects of labor, where an individual will sell labor where he thinks he'll get the best out of it. Kenyan economy may not be able to sustain those who are out there, or pay them adequately. So if we can't bring them back home, the idea is to explore ways in which we can tap their skill and utilize it even while they're outside the country.
Certainly is an interesting way to look at it, because you have to, in some way, benefit from, I suppose, the patriotic ties that many people who leave Africa have still to the continent. But there does seem to be a strong move towards, for example, Nigeria, many Nigerians coming back home and helping to build the local economy. Do you find that in your experience?
Definitely. We see 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world at this stage are in sub-Saharan Africa. So for us as a company that's trying to accelerate our growth and driving that through, we have tapped into overseas networks of diaspora. We approach MBA students who are studying at overseas universities, and we encourage them to come back. And we've been really successful in terms of that, especially for the more middle to senior management that we're looking for in our companies.
But do you have to pay them competitive rates with investment banks in New York if they've got the qualification to work there as well?
I think it's more competitive too. People have a natural tendency to want to come home. So if you can play a competitive price or salary for someone in Kenya, Nigeria, wherever, they will want to come home. There's a natural tendency to that. We're very fortunate. We have a strong support from the company, because our global HR director is from Kenya. So, and she really believes behind this that if you to bring the diaspora back to Africa, because will tap into the opportunities and will leave some of the more senior skills that need to occur in those countries.
Are we reversing the brain drain, Breeman?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I'm one of those people.
There you go. Tell us about your experience very quickly.
No, when I joined the IMF in 1992, that was what you do. You graduate, you want to join the IMF for the World Bank. Because the wages were good, it was a good lifestyle. 17 years later, you say, well, look, why can't I go and do this at home? And we see that a lot in the bank, especially. A lot of people coming back from the diaspora. And it reminded me, of course, of what was happening in the early 90s in Asia as well, when, in fact, a lot of the people that joined with me in those institutions actually left 2 years later. And those are now the people running everything in Asia. Even Manmohan Singh of India was with the bank at the time, but they all went back. Yeah. So I think I definitely see it happening, and I also see it happening in the private sector as well. Yeah.
Is there a role for importing skills, if you could call it that, into the agricultural space in South Africa? Do you see a need for that, or is it mainly predominantly a focus on developing the skills of the people who are here?
You must remember, when you talk agriculture, you're talking from survival, to very sophisticated people with working very sophisticated machinery. So from what I've worked with is mainly on the lower level, but I have friends who are in the technical side and training there. There's very little that comes back. We've got to train them here. But I'll tell you what else has happened. We were talking about the universities just now. What's this from Nigeria? There are, let me say hundreds, I haven't the statistic, but there are lots of people trained at colleges and universities in agriculture. Many of them have never been on a farm, but they can't find jobs because the training they've had in the agriculture is not what is needed on the ground in agriculture. They all,
you're learning, it's the theory issue again. Theory versus practical.
It's not only the theory, it's the wrong knowledge that they've picked up. Now, they've gone to learn extension officer. Now he's an extension officer and he's got to go out into the field and train people to plow, but he's never done it. But he's an extension officer. So there's one of the things that government has said to us, if you get this contract, then you must employ the people and use them as facilitators that come out of the universities. But they're not very good facilitators because they don't have the practical work ability that needed on the ground there. And it's actually very sad because there's such a need for agricultural skills in the thing, and it's the wrong one.
James, let's bring the Kenyan agriculture perspective into this. When it comes to addressing the skills needed in the agricultural space, is this a priority right now for you, given the fact that, of course, the economy in Kenya and, of course, more broadly East Africa is still very reliant on agriculture, and subsistence farmers, of course, are plenty in your part of the world?
We realize that Kenya as a country in particular, and maybe East Africa in general, its backbone is agriculture. However much we may want to talk technology, ICT, we want to talk fossil fuels and all that, we still come back to agriculture because one, it provides us with food security, without which whatever other development may not really flourish. Now, I want to agree with one of the panelists there who is talking about going through an education system and coming out and not being very useful at the end of it. In Kenya, for example, you will find that the kind of knowledge that we require is the ability to add value to whatever little that you produce, so that you can be able to sell it, and in selling it, you are able to get money to buy what you may not be producing in your farm. So it is a priority area because, yes, it's a backbone of our economy, And yes, we are focusing on it because we realize that we need to reorient the skills development in the agricultural sector. Suffice here to say that in the Ministry of Education now is domiciled a semi-autonomous government agency, the TVETA, that is the Technical Vocational and Education Training Agency. And it's looking at connecting industry and training so that if it is agriculture, what kind of training is it that is demanded in the area of agriculture, and which, if given to the boys and girls who are out there who did not make it to the universities, they can be able to sustain themselves as well as produce goods that are value added and which can get them some kind of earning.
Yeah. Well, James, we've come to the end of the discussion. Unfortunately, there's so much to talk about when it comes to this. Of course, it brings up the whole issue around education, government policies. But JJ, I'm just going to let you have the last word because I want to talk about the ROI, return on investment, for the private sector to invest in skills development. Does it make sense?
I think it makes sense in both areas in terms of being able to support our partners, making business more easier to deal with and to actually resolve, to develop the partnerships with ministries of health or ministries of energy, but also internally, because if we don't have the skills internally, we can't be effective and sustainable as a business going forward. So for us, it's an imperative that we actually do it.
Thank you so much for joining us today. That's it for this edition of the Philips African Dialogues. Of course, thank you to JJ van Dongen, Dani Steen, Lone Sharp, Ibrima Fal, and from our bureau in Nairobi, James Murrow. Until next time, it's goodbye and thanks so much for joining us.